You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Welcome back to Access Minnesota. Dr. Alex Jassen is an assistant professor of early Judaism in the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. He is currently serving as an academic advisor to the Science Museum of Minnesota for their exhibit, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Words That Changed the World. Professor Jassen, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, Professor Jassen, tell us what the Dead Sea Scrolls are and a little bit more about the exhibit.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are 2,000-year-old documents, primarily written in Hebrew with a few in Aramaic and Greek. And they take us back to a time in ancient Judaism where the Bible was still in formation. What we can now call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament for Christianity. We have about 200 or so copies, manuscripts of books that we now call part of the Bible. Books of Genesis, books of Jeremiah, books of Deuteronomy, books of the Psalms. But there's more than just biblical manuscripts there. This is almost certainly a library of an ancient Jewish community that had retreated to living in the desert because they were upset with the way that the establishment was running things in the Jerusalem temple. So we also have their very, very carefully written rules and regulations for their own community life, their vision about what it meant to live Jewish law and ritual, live a life of a Jew at this time period. And they also cultivated writings of other ancient Jewish groups at this time period. Other works that they found amenable and agreeable to their ideology, they cultivated and they included in their library.
What was your role with the Science Museum in regard to this exhibit?
So the scrolls themselves really speak for themselves. You walk into the scroll room, you will walk into the scroll room at the museum and you'll be in awe. You'll be in awe of walking back 2,000 years to be able to look at scrolls that in many ways haven't been seen except for maybe a few dozen people in the last 2,000 years. But the scrolls are only part of the story. To understand why the scrolls have revolutionized the study of the Bible and the origins of Judaism and Christianity requires some knowledge of the broader historical context. And this is what I did, this is what I helped with the exhibit. I was part of a team of academic advisors that opened up what it meant to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible, what it meant to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls in ancient Judaism or early Christianity, what artifacts should be on display to illuminate the world of the scrolls, what texts, other ancient texts, what other ancient information should be displayed alongside the scrolls. And that was my primary responsibility, to open up that broader context of the scrolls.
How did you personally get interested in the scrolls?
Well, for me, the scrolls were a meeting point for all the things that I was academically interested in. I was very interested in the study of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. I was also very interested in the world of Judaism that develops in the 1st or 2nd centuries of the Common Era. And to put it in perspective, the world of the Bible, the world of ancient Israel and the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament really ends around the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. So you're looking at about 500 or so years in between the world of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and the world of later Judaism that develops into the relatively, what we call modern forms of Judaism, as well as the origins of Christianity. So what happens at that time period? Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we had many, many sources. Often they were in translations from their originals in Hebrew or Aramaic, preserved in later medieval scribal traditions. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, we were able to walk back into that very formative time period that for me was so interesting to think about. How did you get from the world of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism to the world of early Christianity and Judaism as it develops over time? And the Dead Sea Scrolls take us back into that world.
Professor Jassen, before we went on the air, you had mentioned that the scrolls were in a cave for about 2,000 years. They obviously didn't fare particularly well given their exposure to the elements and the animals that occasionally would munch on them. But once they got in the hands of humans, they were in danger as well. Take us through that process, and what have we learned about preserving those documents in more recent times?
Well, we've learned a few things that seem pretty simple to all of us. Don't smoke a cigarette while you're studying ancient scrolls. Don't use natural light. And the truth is, this sounds kind of humorous, but if you look at some of the early photographs, and you'll see some of this in the exhibit of scholars working on these scrolls, they're actually smoking cigarettes while working on the scrolls. They're reading them in natural light. And in many ways, the use of natural light was their attempt. They really were so excited to see what was in these scrolls. They were not focused on conservation issues. In many cases, when they would find fragments that they would put back together, because these are mostly fragments, not scrolls, that they had to put these puzzles back together, they would use a piece of tape, and they would take the back of each fragment and tape them together. Now again, this is wonderful for being able to read the scrolls, but these early scholars were not interested at all in the conservation. They didn't know any of these aspects of conservation. Over the last 50 or so years, as the scrolls have come then into the hands of museum curators and conservators, they've worked very hard to undo the 20 years or so of these poor conservation techniques, to the point that you have an entire team working in Israel right now on the Scotch tape problem.
Let's talk about the origin of the scrolls. Do we know who wrote them, how they ended up in the cave? What do we know about the people who actually created the scrolls?
What we're probably looking at with the scrolls is a library of an ancient Jewish community that probably resided at the nearby ancient settlement of Qumran, which you'll hear a lot about in the exhibit. And this was a community that had very, very specific views about what it meant to live life as a Jew, what it meant to live the life of Jewish law and ritual. And as they retreated into their desert settlement, they cultivated those works that they found to be sacred and authoritative. And they also began to write their own vision of what it meant to be a Jew, what it meant to live the life of Judaism. And as they brought together those scrolls to form their authoritative collection of literature, they formed what we now call a library on a very small scale. And in the first century, when the Romans were coming to Jerusalem to squash a revolt that had arisen in Jerusalem, they almost certainly made their way through the Judean desert on their way to Jerusalem. And these ancient Jewish sectarians, seeing that the Romans were coming through town and recognizing that there was going to be a battle with the Romans, they knew what was going to happen, they squirreled away their scrolls in these caves to be essentially there until what they thought was going to be their victory over the Romans. But of course it was not to be, and they were housed in those caves for 2,000 years for us to find later on.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit will be on display at the Science Museum through October, correct?
Through October. But the wonderful thing about the exhibit, and this is a point of the conservation, is that the scrolls themselves cannot be on display for long periods of time in light. So there can be 15 total scrolls on display. And the first 5 sets of scrolls that you'll see right now are going to switch out towards the beginning of the summer, and a new set of 5 scrolls are going to be brought in. And towards the end of the summer, a new set of 5 scrolls are going to be there. So if you go to the exhibit later in the summer, you'll see 5 different scrolls than you're seeing right now, and so also in the fall.
Professor Alex Jassen, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for this month's show. We'll see you next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.